Hi, my dear students and my dear colleagues. In my previous video, we talked about Julius Caesar's superstition, and we also talked about how the soothsayer warns Caesar to be careful on the Ides of March, that is on the 15th of March. In spite of that warning, Caesar ignores him by calling him a dreamer, a fool, and then he passes on. Okay. Then you have a meeting between Cassius and Brutus. And as I have already told you, Cassius is a cunning, clever manipulator. He is a great observer. He quickly sees through the deeds of men. And such men are dangerous. This is what Caesar says a little later in the scene about Cassius. He is a great observer. And Cassius has a lean and hungry look. He is tall and lean, and his eyes are wolfish eyes. He has hungry look. That means he always observes people. He is a great mind reader, Cassius. And here you see Cassius meeting Brutus, and here Cassius is trying his best to poison Brutus's mind against Caesar. And Cassius talks about how certain best respected people of Rome love and admire Brutus for his patriotism, for his love of his country. And then Cassius goes on to say that Brutus cannot see himself, his greatness, and hence he would like to be Brutus's mirror to reflect how great Brutus is. Here Cassius is slowly flattering Brutus into conspiracy against Caesar. You have to understand this. And Brutus, I have told you, he lives in an imaginary world of idealism. Practicalism is different from idealism, And an idealist sometimes also has to think practically to understand who is who and what is what around him. But Brutus doesn't do that. He doesn't do it. That is why, or there lies Brutus's weakness. Brutus easily falls to flattery. If you closely read the lines in the play, you will understand that even Brutus, makes a fool of himself by pretending to be a great idealist. Okay. After that, and perhaps there, I stopped my lecture in my previous video when Brutus says that he is ready to die to preserve and protect the honor of his people and the honor of his country. Brutus says he is in love of honor. He loves the name of honor more than his fear of death. That means that Brutus is ready to die to preserve and protect the honor of his country and his countrymen. Don't even think this is too much of idealism. The Kannada meaning of idealism is Adarshamaya Vada. Understood? So if you live in this imaginary world of idealism, you fail to understand what goes on around you. If you fail to be practical, and if you want to just to be an idealist, you will miserably end up as a failure. And when Brutus says that he loves honor more than he fears death, Cassius catches hold of that word honor uttered by Brutus, and he gives a lengthy speech on honor. Who? Cassius. Look at this. Cassius says, well, honor is the subject of my story, he says. What is Cassius' story? Cassius' story is about the weak Caesar trying to be crowned and trying to become the king of Rome, which Cassius doesn't like. And Cassius tells a big lie that if Caesar becomes a king, he would misuse his power and position, and he would become a dictator, and he would change all his people into his slaves. Caesar, mind you, Caesar hasn't yet become a king. But Cassius wants that to be prevented. That is why he wants to eliminate Caesar with the help of Brutus. Because whatever Brutus says, people would readily listen to him. Because as Casca very rightly puts it, Brutus Brutus sits high in all people's hearts. This is what Casca says about Brutus in the later part of the same scene. Or in the next scene, I suppose, in the third scene. He says, Brutus sits high in all people's hearts. And if Brutus is made the leader of the conspiracy, and killing Caesar, which is an offense, would look like virtue and worthiness if Brutus leads the conspiracy. That's what Casca says. If Brutus comes onto our side, whatever appears offense in us would be changed into virtue and worthiness, he says, in the later part of the third scene. So Brutus is so important for all these conspirators like Cassius and others. Hence, Cassius says, well, honor is the subject of my story. Look at this. He says, I cannot tell what you and other men think of this life, he says. Cassius very cunningly, plays on these words to attract Brutus's attention. Cassius says, I don't understand what you think of this life, this wretched life, this life of a slave under under Caesar, if Caesar becomes the king and becomes a dictator. And Cassius says, if Caesar becomes the king and a dictator, he is not going to live. He doesn't want to live a life of a slave. Cassius very clearly says that. Look at this. He says, I cannot tell what you and other men think of this life. But for my single self, he says, but as far as I am concerned, this is my view, Cassius says. I had as lief not be as live to be in awe of such a great thing as I myself. Look at this. I would rather not live than to live the life of a slave under a weak man called Caesar. I would rather not live. I would rather commit suicide. If at all I am made to live the life of a slave under this weak Caesar. Cassius's main intention is to picture Caesar as a weak man, incapable of becoming a king and incapable of becoming a successful administrator. Cassius says that only an incapable ruler has all the qualities of becoming a dictator. Because a dictator can keep all his people's mouth shut by dominating upon them. Understood? That's why he says, I had as lief not be as live to be in awe of such a thing as myself. He is calling Caesar a thing. He is as strong as I am, Cassius says. Cassius says that Caesar is as strong as he himself is, as weak as he himself is. And he goes on to say that Caesar is weaker than Cassius when it comes to, showing courage while swimming in the flooded Tiber river. And Cassius also talks about Caesar's falling sickness and how Caesar cried aloud as a sick girl requesting a soldier called Titinius for some medicine or for some drink. Hence Cassius says, this man has now become a god. He says, this man who couldn't swim, this man who couldn't control his fever, such a weak personality, should he become the king of Rome? If such a weak man becomes the king of Rome, what would happen to the people of Rome? What would be the fate of the people of Rome? Only such weak people would try to become dictators and make their people slaves. And look at this. Look at the way Cassius argues so logically and slowly poisons Brutus's mind against Caesar. He says, Cassius says, I was born free as Caesar. Look at this. Look at his argument. He says, even he was born as free as Caesar was born. So were you. Then he includes Brutus. So were you. Even you were born as free as Caesar was. First point. Second point, he talks about, the food they have taken to grow up. He says, we both have fed as well. We both have taken the same food as Caesar has been taking. And we are brought up in the same environment as Caesar has been brought up. And then he goes on to the third point and says, we both can endure the winter's cold as well as he. When there is winter and when the biting winds are blowing across and the winter is so chill and cold, it needs a lot of courage to tolerate winter's cold, especially in England, my dear friends. And he says, Cassius has the same tolerance. Cassius can tolerate the winter's cold. Brutus can tolerate the winter's cold in the same way as Caesar could tolerate. Then how could Caesar be so great, greater than these two? Is his argument. That is Cassius's argument. And now he talks about Caesar's weaknesses. He says, you just go through these lines. Keep your textbook aside and go through these lines. He says, for once upon a raw and gusty wind, the troubled Tiber chafing with the shores, Caesar said to me, darest thou, Cassius, now leap in with me into this angry flood and swim to yonder point? This is how Caesar challenged Cassius. When the Tiber river was in floods, when the Tiber river was very angry, it was roaring. The waves became huge. And in such a dangerous situation, Caesar challenged Cassius to jump into the river and swim along with him to the other point, to the other bank, from one bank to the other bank. This is how Caesar challenged Cassius. He said, "Darest thou, Cassius, now leap in with me into this angry flood and swim to the yonder point?" Can you jump into this angry flood along with me? And can you swim along with me? Can you defeat in the swimming race? And let us see who reaches the other bank first. You or I, was the challenge, made by Caesar. And when Cassius was challenged like that, do you know what Cassius did? This is what Cassius says. "Upon the word, accorded as I was, I punched him." Upon the word, as soon as Caesar said it, I was fully dressed and I did not have time to remove my dress. As I was fully dressed, I jumped into the river as soon as Caesar challenged me. He says, accorded as I was completely dressed. In spite of being dressed completely, I took up the challenge and I jumped. I plunged in and I bade him follow. Actually, Caesar should have jumped in and then asked Cassius to follow him. But here it became the other way around. It was Cassius who first jumped into the angry flood, and it was Cassius who asked Caesar to follow him. I plunged him and I asked him, Caesar, to follow me. So indeed he did. When he jumped into the river, we both started swimming. The river was, foaming and fretting, and the water currents were very strong. They were pushing us down. With our strong muscles, with our strong sinews, we started, swimming against the water currents, and we were trying to reach the other bank, from one bank to the other bank. The torrent roared. We did buffet it with our lusty sinews. We fought with those angry waves with the lusty, very strong muscles, sinews, throwing it aside and stemming it with hearts of controversy. So goes the challenge. And then suddenly Cassius talks about this. But before we could arrive the point proposed, here means before. Cassius says, before we could reach the other bank, in the middle, Caesar became very weak, he says. And here we could arrive the point proposed. Caesar cried. Look at this, Caesar. That was Caesar's weakness Cassius is talking about. Caesar cried, "Help me, Cassius, or I sink." This is what Caesar cried. This is how Caesar cried. "Oh, Cassius, help me. If you don't help me, I will sink, I will drown, and I will be dead. Help me, Cassius, or I sink." And do you know how Cassius describes himself? When he saved Caesar, he compares himself to the Roman hero Aeneas. Aeneas, a young hero Aeneas, who helped his elderly father Anchises from the burning Troy. There is a huge love story between Paris, who belongs to Troy, the country Troy, and Helen, who belongs to Greece. Helen runs away with Paris to Troy, and to bring Helen back, the king of Greece, Menelaus, and his brother Agamemnon and Ulysses and Achilles, all these people go to Troy in 1,000 ships. That's why Shakespeare says, while talking about Helen, Shakespeare says, this was the face that landed 1,000 ships. The face that landed 1,000 ships. So all the soldiers, Greeks, went to Troy in 1,000 ships, and there was a huge battle between the Greeks and the Trojans. The soldiers of Troy are called the people of Troy are called the Trojans. And the war between the Trojans and the Greeks went on for 10 years, my dear students. And after that, I don't want to go in detail into these things. After that, the Greeks could enter the fort, the strong fortress or fort of Troy and destroy the entire city, entire town, entire country, and set fire to the entire Troy, killing all men and taking all women as slaves. And when Troy was burning, Aeneas, who happens to be one of the descendants of the Trojan heroes, Aeneas saved his old father Cassius and his son and some of his traditional gods. He took all these people, all these things, his father, his son and all these gods, and escaped Troy, went to Italy. He went to Italy and fought a terrible war there, and he founded a new empire for himself in Italy. Later on, Sophocles writes a play called the Aeneid. The Aeneid, which talks about Aeneas and his adventures. Okay. And now Cassius compares himself to that Trojan hero Aeneas. He says, and when Caesar cried, "Help me, Cassius, or I sink," I, as Aeneas, this is said by Cassius, I, as Aeneas, our great ancestor, did from the flames of Troy upon his shoulder the old Cassius bear. Just as Aeneas carried his old father Cassius on his shoulders and saved him from the burning Troy, so from the waves of Tiber I saved Caesar. Just as Aeneas saved his father Cassius from the flames of Troy, Cassius says he saved this weak Caesar from the angry flood of the Tiber. Look at the comparison he draws, my dear friends. I, as Aeneas, our ancestor, as this Aeneas did from the flames of Troy upon his shoulders the old Cassius carry, so from the waves of the river Tiber did I, the tired Caesar. Even I carried this tired Caesar upon my shoulder and swam across the Tiber river onto the other bank and saved the life of Caesar. And then Cassius doesn't want such a weak man to become a dictator and a hero like Cassius becoming his slave. Look at this. After saying this, I helped Caesar by carrying him on my shoulder. He says, and this man, this weak man whom I saved, if I had not saved, he would have died by drowning, this Caesar. And this man is now become a god. This weak man has now become a god. And Cassius is stronger than Caesar. And this Cassius has become a wretched creature. A wretched creature is a useless person without any individuality and honor. A slave. A wretched creature is almost a slave. Cassius says, this weak man whom I saved from the river Tiber has become a god, and the person who has saved him has become his slave. Should I be his slave? He says. And look at this. This man is now become a god, and Cassius has become a wretched creature, and Cassius must bend his body. Should I bend my body if Caesar carelessly but nod at him? If Caesar comes and looks at Cassius, and if Caesar says like this, should I bend my body before this weak Caesar whom I saved from the river Tiber? I repeat these lines. Follow these things. This man is now become a god, and Cassius is a wretched creature and must bend his body when, if Caesar carelessly, but not on him. If Caesar carelessly, just casually, if Caesar looks at Cassius, should Cassius bend his body? And then immediately after this, he talks about Caesar's another weakness. He says, and he had a fever when he was in Spain. He remembers another incident of Caesar's weakness. Cassius is saying all these things to Brutus just to poison his mind against Caesar by telling him that such a weak Caesar should not be allowed to be crowned a king. If such a weak man becomes a king, he would definitely become a dictator and make all his people his slaves. See, he talks about another weakness of Caesar. Cassius says, he had a fever when he was in Spain. And when that fit was on him, he's talking about that fit. A fit means a disease. That falling sickness Caesar has. It is also called epilepsy. In Kannada it is called murcha roga. Okay, that falling sickness. He talks about the falling sickness. My question is, what if Caesar has a falling sickness? What if Caesar could not swim? Do you mean to say that such a man cannot become or cannot be a good administrator? He can still be a good man, a good administrator. But here Cassius is playing on Brutus's, what shall I say, idealism, and slowly poisoning his mind against Caesar. And Cassius very well knows that Caesar is capable of ruling Rome. But he wanted Pompey to be the king of Rome, not Caesar, because Cassius is a very strong supporter of Pompey. Look at this, Cassius. He says, he had a fever when he was in Spain. And when the fit was on him, when that fever, when that sickness, that fallen sickness on him, I did mark how he did shake. I did mark means I did observe. I observed, Cassius says. When Caesar had that fit, when Caesar had that falling sickness, Cassius says he observed how Caesar started shaking. I did mark how he did shake. Then immediately he uses irony, Vyangya. He says, it is true, this God did shake. Caesar now has become a god. Then when he was in Spain, the same God shook terribly and cried like a sick girl for a drink. And when the fit was in him, I did mark how he did shake. Yes, it is true, this God did shake. And look at Cassius's anger on Caesar. Cassius says, then when the fit was on him, his covered lips became the lips of a coward. His lips started shaking. And his covered lips did from their color fly. The active lips became very pale and inactive, he says. There was fear of death on the face of Caesar when Caesar had that falling sickness. And he says, he talks about his lips, he says, his covered lips did from their color fly. And then he talks about his eye. And the same eye whose bend doth o'er the world. And the same eye today, the same eye of Caesar stands tall and stands threatening to the entire world, entire Roman world. And the same eye whose bend doth o'er the world, and such an eye did lose his luster. Even that eye today, this eye is commanding his people. And the same eye, when he was in Spain, when he got that fever, the eye lost its shining. It lost its luster, and Caesar started groaning, screaming in pain. And I did hear him groan, he says. And I did hear him groan. Hey, even that tongue. Now he talks about the tongue. Look at this. Look at the logical way Cassius is talking about Caesar's weakness. He has talked about Caesar's weakness in that swimming race. Now he talks about Caesar's sickness, and he talks about, the lips which became cowardly, and he talks about the eye which lost its shining luster. Now he is talking about the tongue. And then the tongue of his that bade the Romans mark him and write his speeches in their books. Whenever Caesar speaks, people start writing his speeches in their books. That means every word of Caesar has become, an order to the people of Rome. Every word, just as a critic says, every word of Shakespeare is a poem by itself. In the same way, every speech of Caesar has become a commandment, a holy commandment to all the people of Rome. Whenever Caesar speaks, people are ready to listen to him and write down his speeches in their books, it seems. And that tongue of his that made the Romans observe him, look at him, listen to him, mark him, and write his speeches in their books. And even that tongue, alas, that tongue cried. When Caesar was down with that fever, alas, that tongue of Caesar cried. How did it cry? The tongue said, "Give me something tedious," as a sick girl says. The tongue cried like a sick girl. "Give me something tedious," like a sick girl. Then suddenly Cassius expresses his anger, his intolerance at such a weak man trying to be crowned and trying to become the dictator of Rome. He says, "Ye gods, it doth amaze me, a man of such a feeble temper should so get the start of the majestic world and bear the palm alone." How should he wear the palm, the crown alone? Such a man of feeble temper. This is too much for Cassius to tolerate. Look at Cassius says, "Ye gods, it doth amaze me. It is really shocking to me that a man of such a feeble temper, a man of such a weak personality, should so get the start of the majestic world." He is getting a start of the majestic world, means he is trying to become the king of Rome. The world is Rome here. Should so get the start of the majestic world and bear the palm alone, he says. How can we allow such a weak man to become the king and wear this crown, palm? Palm leaves always stood for victory during the ancient days in Rome. Any man who won a race or a competition was given a wreath, a crown made of palm leaves, which always symbolized victory, which always symbolized, some greatness. That's why here he says, a man of such a feeble temper should so get the start of the majestic world and bear the palm alone. How can we allow such a man to wear the crown alone? Such a weak man. When Cassius completes his dialogue, you hear another general shout from the crowd. Flourish of trumpets, a second shout. Then Brutus says, "Oh, another general's shout. I do believe that these applauses are from some new honors that are heaped on Caesar." once again Brutus is troubled by the second shout. Brutus expresses his doubts that Caesar is going to be honored by the people to occupy some position of greatness. Then Cassius then says, why man, if you keep allowing these people to consider Caesar their god, one day this growing power will make him grow like a Colossus, he says. Colossus was the tall, huge statue of Apollo, which stood at the entrance of the harbor in a place called Rhodes, R-H-O-D-E-S. And it is said that ships used to sail between the two legs of that Colossus. Colossus is such a huge statue. It was, demolished in a war in ancient Greece, I am told. And I have read it also. I had been to Rome recently and I saw all these things. I saw the place where Caesar was assassinated. I even saw the place where, Caesar was cremated. All these things. That's why it was really touching, to see all these things in Rome. Look at this. Cassius says, why man, he doth bestride the narrow world like a Colossus. And we petty men, when he becomes a Colossus, we will become his petty men, slaves. We petty men walk under his huge legs and peep about to find ourselves dishonorable graves, he says. We will have dishonorable graves. A slave always has a dishonorable grave. If Caesar is allowed to grow like a Colossus, we will become his slaves and we will not have graves. Slaves don't have graves. They are dead. After their death, their bodies would be thrown aside to be rotted above the earth. That's why it says dishonorable graves. We will become his slaves and we will have dishonorable graves. Okay. Then he also talks about the two words Brutus and Caesar. And thereby, he tries to, cause jealousy in the mind of Brutus against Caesar. He says, look at the words, two words, Caesar and Brutus. Both the names have 6 letters. Then he says, why should then Caesar's name be sounded greater than you? He tells Brutus. And thereby, he is increasing Brutus's jealousy for Caesar. Okay. And then he talks about, Brutus's ancestor called Lucius Junius Brutus, and I will talk about this in my next video. Okay. Till then, keep chewing up on whatever I have, talked about Cassius and Brutus, and we will meet up in the next video. Bye for now. God bless you all.